So at least one expert says it's unacceptable that South Africans often resort to violence to resolve disputes and is actually calling for a nationwide debate on this issue. There are proposals that this should take place in homes, communities, workplaces, religious institutions, civil society organizations, and within political parties themselves. For more on his views, let's bring in now Wits School of Governance Associate Professor William Gumede, who joins us via our video link. William, great to chat to you. Thanks for making time. Many refer to violence in this country as our 12th official language, but in your making this argument, you also speak of different types of violence. For those unfamiliar with this language, what do you mean?
Yes, so the first thing is just that violence have now turned epidemic levels. I mean, we talk about the COVID-19 epidemic, but violence has been with us as an epidemic, and we're really going to have to deal with it. And there are different types of violence. I mean, we've seen the last couple of years, domestic violence has spirals. We've seen violence, against women and against children, and against the vulnerable, against, the aged have increased. We've seen, violence by organized groups like taxi associations over markets say. We've seen, just the last couple of weeks, actually, in Cape Town, dozens of people have died in a kind of violence. But we've also seen more recently organized groups, such as the ANC Veterans Association, controversies where regularly embark on violence without being brought to account. So we've got a violence on the one hand, but then the other part of it, nobody's been held accountable, and then we create this culture of violence. But even in political situations, we've seen, protests, community protests over poor public services often turn violence. We've seen trade unions when they march, pressing for higher wages or against retrenchments. There's violence associated with it. Even students, when they demand free fees, are frequently violent. We've seen, for example, the University of KwaZulu-Natal, was it two years ago, libraries being burned, the law library being burned, and so on.
Right. And, I find that many people are able to diagnose the problem, sometimes really well, but it appears that there haven't been, call it, compelling solutions just as yet. My take is because there isn't enough introspection taking place. But for that to happen, there needs to be a serious self-examination, the kind often that challenges even what we know to be true about what our culture, religious, even perhaps societal expectations call of us. To what extent do you think people are willing to go down that route, challenging the fundamentals of what they think maketh a good society?
Well, unfortunately, we have to, as South Africans, and perhaps particularly black South Africans, because I speak for white South Africans, but, black South Africans, we really have to challenge ourselves now. We have to begin to think in terms of, why are we where we are? Why are we struggling with the issues that we're struggling with? Can we just blame flippantly apartheid or, a white monopoly capital or any other issue? And violence is one of those issues that we really have to, have an introspect. In 1994, when we created this new South Africa, the new democratic South Africa, we already started with a culture of violence. You have to think about it. Colonialism was violent, apartheid was violent, so there was a culture of violence. White society was violent, they were militarized. The state was violent against blacks, so, a culture of violence. And then, of course, the opposition against apartheid, particularly in the last couple of years, were also violent. So now you almost have not only a culture of violence, but it now becomes almost a cycle of violence. The state is violent, and then you have the opposition violent. But sadly, also what we also have to acknowledge that our cultures have been violent. White culture has been violent, and also black culture has been very violent. And then people see often that, the solutions to a problem that violence can resolve it. And I think we'll have to start there. We should stop using violence or making it socially and culturally and politically acceptable to resolve problems through violence. I think that's really where we start with. And then we have to almost start right at the beginning in families. Where, I grew up where, I was beaten. Totally, if you've done something wrong, you're beaten, and that was culturally acceptable. But we should stop that, because that also create a culture of violence because, one use violence in the domestic situation to discipline. So, the person, the victim who receives the violence also, for him or her or their child, violence become acceptable.
Right.
Culturally and socially, and he or she will also use violence. So we really have to start in a family setting, almost like we have to re-educate the whole society, coming from the home, but also every other level of society.
There's certainly a feeling that violence is role modeled through generations. I guess it comes as no surprise that you're also calling on a national debate around this. Let's say that does happen. What do you imagine would be the central question to be asked, and what ought to be the outcomes of this debate after the process?
I think the central thing that we have to do, we have to desensitize ourselves from violence because, there's violence are so systemic that people often, something violent happens, they don't get outraged, they don't get, they almost just strike it off because, we sensitize. And then secondly, we have to bring our humanity back. And often, sadly, as Black South Africans, and even not only us, also Black Africans in other African countries, Black lives are often doesn't have importance. So during the colonial period and during the apartheid, of course, Black lives were not seen as important by apartheid governments or the colonial government. So violence was meted out on Black lives, and it was not seen as important. The sad thing is also in the post-colonial period and post-apartheid period, when we now have Black governments in charge, again, they look at Black lives in the same way as the apartheid government and the colonial government. But sadly also, fellow Blacks, ordinary Blacks, often also look at other Blacks' life as not important, and can mete out violence on others, perceiving another Black life as not important. And we have to get that debate and that dialogue going. And then also the cultural norms where violence is acceptable, we really have to say to ourselves that, if there's a cultural norm, part of our makeup where violence is acceptable, we really have to, distance ourselves from that cultural norm. It cannot be a cultural norm in our times anymore.
Yeah. On that note, some scholars actually speak of a pornography of violence, the sense that, people sometimes go out of their way to view violence, almost put it under the spotlight, because in some ways it makes them feel better about their own lives. With that in mind, how do you reckon, people within the media, for instance, how do you reckon those players in our society should respond to violence? Is this something that we show to reveal the society as it is, or do we become more circumspect with consideration of the possible effects?
I think it's not one or the other, but what is missing, in the media and the coverage is, the pressure on the response to the violence. The idea there is violence, but we are not asking the hard questions. Why is the violence continuing, and what is it in our makeup that we have to change, and why is the state not enforcing the rules to stop the violence and to prevent the violence? So yes, of course, the role of the media is to expose, but the role of the media is also to hold those accountable who are violent, and also to hold the state accountable for enforcing the rules to prevent violence, but also to hold the society, the cultural institutions, the political institutions also accountable. I mean, I'll just give you an example that people often cannot make the link between the violence that's happening and what, often politicians who talk violence. So we see, violent rhetoric in South Africa seems to be very trendy among politicians. And we've seen it even, of course, during the struggle, we had violent songs because, the anti-apartheid struggle was a violent struggle, often against a violent apartheid government. But the problem is if we continue to revere violence, even during our songs and the way we talk in parliament or in politics, that encourages violence in other parts of society also. So even if we talk violence in our homes, even if we don't mete out the violence, talking in a violent way or encouraging also encourage physical violence itself.
A lot to consider. Thanks very much indeed for your take on this matter. William Gumede is with Wits School of Governance. Once again, William, thanks very much indeed.